Imagine for a second a single human lifetime where your country morphs from this fragile, hopeful democracy into a ruthless fascist military empire.
Right, which is already a huge shift.
Huge, but then you watch it survive the literal apocalypse of nuclear annihilation.
That's utter devastation.
Yeah, and then just when you think the story is completely over, you watch it rise from the irradiated ashes to become the second largest economic superpower on Earth.
It sounds made up.
It totally sounds like the plot of some dystopian sci-fi novel, but this isn't fiction. This was the lived reality for millions of people in Japan under the reign of a single man.
It really, it challenges everything we think we know about how societies evolve. I mean, we usually think of a nation's identity as something that moves at a glacial pace.
Right, over centuries.
Exactly. But to see a state tear itself down to the foundation, rebuild itself as a completely different architectural structure.
And then do it all over again.
Yeah, do it all over again in the span of just a few decades. It's staggering.
And that is exactly what we are exploring in this deep dive. We are looking at the Shōwa era.
A fascinating period.
It really is. So this is a 63-year period stretching from December 25, 1926 to January 7th, 1989. And it perfectly aligns with the reign of Emperor Shōwa, who is better known in the West as Hirohito.
Right.
We have this incredibly dense stack of historical records, political analyses, and economic data sitting right in front of us today. And our goal is to map out this unbelievable whiplash of Japan's 20th century for you.
Because there's really nothing else like it in modern history.
No, there isn't. We want to help you understand the actual granular mechanics of how a nation reinvents itself so drastically and, explore the dizzying paradoxes hidden right behind the very name of the era itself.
Yeah, because the irony of that name is just profound.
It really is. Let's unpack that.
Well, if you look at the etymology, the word Shōwa is constructed from two kanji characters.
Yeah.
They're taken from a classical Chinese text known as the Book of Documents.
Oh.
And depending on how you interpret it, it translates to enlightened peace or radiant Japan.
Enlightened peace. I mean, knowing what is about to happen in the 1930s and 40s, that is a really tough pill to swallow.
It's incredibly dark in retrospect. And what is fascinating about the naming process is that this wasn't their only option.
Oh, really? They had backups.
Yeah, the scholars and government officials actually had two other candidates on the table. They were Duwa and Genka.
Interesting.
But they specifically selected Shōwa. They deliberately wanted to project this aura of harmony, stability, and a bright, peaceful future, not just to their own citizens, but to the rest of the world.
And Emperor Hirohito really leaned into this messaging right out of the gate, didn't he?
He absolutely did.
Because when you read his enthronement address, which, by the way, was broadcast to the public, he explicitly brings up World War I.
Which was still very fresh in everyone's minds.
Exactly. And he had traveled to Europe, which was super rare for Japanese royalty at the time.
Unprecedented, really.
Yeah. He actually visited the battlefields in France. And in his address, he says, "In the presence of such devastation, I understand the blessing of peace and the necessity of concord among nations."
Wow.
He is looking his people in the eye and saying, essentially, I have seen what modern mechanized war does to a society, and we are choosing peace.
It is a beautifully crafted sentiment. I mean, on a purely diplomatic level, it sounded exactly like what the international community wanted to hear in the late 1920s.
The era of the League of Nations.
Right. But if we pull back the curtain and look at the domestic reality on the ground in Japan, it was a totally different story.
Things were messy.
Very messy. They were entering a highly volatile transition phase. You see, the era right before Shōwa was called the Taishu era.
Okay.
And historians often refer to it as Taishu democracy. It was a period that saw genuine grassroots pushes toward liberal reforms, an expanding middle class and parliamentary politics taking root.
It sounds pretty optimistic.
It was. But right as Hirohito takes the throne and the Shōwa era dawns, that democratic foundation begins to crack under the weight of an incredible legislative contradiction.
I am so glad you brought this up, because this contradiction in 1925 is where the mechanics of authoritarianism really start to show themselves in the sources.
It's the turning point.
It is. So in May of 1925, the Japanese government passes the general election law.
Right.
And on paper, this looks like a massive victory for democracy. It granted universal male suffrage. Any male subject over the age of 25, provided they weren't homeless and had lived in their district for a year, could now vote.
Which is a huge leap.
We are talking about quadrupling the electorate overnight. It went from roughly 3.3 million eligible voters to 12.5 million.
That's a massive influx of new voices.
Yeah, and if you just read that headline, you think, wow, the people are finally taking the wheel.
But the fine print is where the danger lies.
Always is.
Because simultaneously, almost in the exact same breath, the government passed something called the Peace Preservation Law. And this is the fatal blow.
Tell us about that.
The Peace Preservation Law essentially criminalized any group or individual that sought to alter the system of government or abolish private ownership of property.
So wait, I'm trying to wrap my head around how they justified this legally. It's like throwing open the front doors of this massive, lavish party.
Right. Expanding the guest list.
Yeah, quadrupling the guest list, inviting everyone in the city. But simultaneously, you hire these aggressive armed bouncers to roam the crowd and immediately arrest anyone who talks about the wrong political subjects.
That analogy is incredibly accurate.
How does a government expand the vote and criminalize dissent at the exact same time without causing a total revolt?
To understand the why behind the bouncers, you really have to look at the global anxiety of the conservative Japanese elites at the time.
The fire of what was happening elsewhere.
Exactly. The Russian Revolution had just violently overthrown an empire right in their backyard a few years prior.
Ah, the Bolsheviks.
Right. The establishment politicians, the wealthy families, and the monarchy were absolutely terrified of the Bolsheviks.
They didn't want that spreading to Tokyo.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't view socialist, communist, or even strong labor movements as normal political opposition. They viewed them as a highly contagious ideological virus that could destroy the state from the inside out.
So the Peace Preservation Law wasn't just about stopping, like, an armed uprising in the streets.
Not at all.
It was a preemptive strike on the mind.
Exactly. It was thought policing. And the legal wording was intentionally vague.
Of course it was.
That allowed the state to stretch the definition of subversion into areas that had absolutely nothing to do with armed rebellion. It seeped into the academic spheres.
So it wasn't just radicals getting arrested?
No. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, you could be targeted by the Special Higher Police, which was essentially a thought police division, just for discussing Marxist economic theory in a university seminar.
Wow.
Or for organizing a tenant farmers union to ask for better conditions. It systematically crushed left-wing activism.
And reading through the history, they used this specific, almost mystical concept to justify the crackdown. They kept repeating this word.
Kokutai.
Gokutai. It is the linchpin of this entire era's ideology.
What does that actually mean?
It translates roughly to national polity, or the fundamental character of the Japanese nation. But it is much deeper than a political term. It's a spiritual one.
Spiritual how?
Well, the concept of kokutai positioned the emperor not just as a monarch, like a king in Europe, but as the sacred patriarchal head of the Japanese family.
Like the literal father of the nation.
Right. The state, the emperor, and the soul of the citizen were all completely intertwined. You couldn't separate them.
So if you are a citizen protesting for better wages or arguing against a specific government policy, the state doesn't just say you're politically wrong.
Yeah.
They say, you are attacking the kokutai. You are attacking the very soul of what it means to be Japanese.
Precisely. It turns political disagreement into treason and heresy.
That is terrifying. It is. And when you combine that ideological stranglehold with the devastating economic impact of the looming Great Depression, parliamentary democracy in Japan never really stood a chance.
It was doomed.
The civilian politicians spent all their energy building this massive authoritarian legal apparatus
Yeah.
to crush internal left-wing dissent because they thought the communists were the biggest threat.
Which leads to this massive, tragic historical irony.
Oh, absolutely.
The civilian government is so obsessed with locking down the front door to keep the socialists out, they completely fail to realize that their own military is burning down the house from the inside.
That is the tragic reality of the 1930s.
So how does that happen?
Well, to understand how the military went rogue, we have to look at the catalyst. Why was the military so angry? Why did the civilian government lose all its leverage over its own generals?
Right.
It comes down to a really volatile cocktail of international humiliation and severe domestic economic collapse in the 1920s.
Let's start with the international humiliation, because it really sets the stage.
Okay, let's do it.
Following World War I, the major Western powers, primarily the US and the UK, were heavily influenced by this Wilsonian idea of general disarmament.
Right, nobody wanted a repeat of the trenches.
Nobody wanted another global slaughter. So they convened the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 1922.
The goal was to prevent a naval arms race in the Pacific.
Right. And the resulting five-power naval limitation agreement literally sets a mathematical cap on the total tonnage of battleships and aircraft carriers each nation can possess.
Which sounds practical on paper.
Sure. And the ratio they land on is 5.5.3. That's 5 for the US, 5 for the UK, and only 3 for Japan.
Now, if you are a pragmatic Japanese naval planner at the time, you actually know that the 5.5.3 ratio is perfectly fine.
Wait, really? It was enough?
Oh, yeah. The global appetite for war is basically non-existent right then, and that tonnage is more than enough to maintain defensive hegemony in the Western Pacific.
But optics matter.
Optics are everything. To the rising ultranationalist factions within the Japanese military, this ratio wasn't a peace treaty. It was a blatant, insulting attempt by white, Western imperial powers to artificially stunt Japanese growth.
They felt targeted.
They saw it as the West declaring, "We are the first-class nations, and you will permanently remain a second-class nation."
Wow, okay.
They felt the West was hypocritically meddling in Asia, an area where they believed Japan should be the undisputed leader.
And if you think that 5.5.3 ratio stoked resentment, just 2 years later, the United States passes the Immigration Act of 1924.
Total disaster.
It is a catastrophic diplomatic failure. The U.S. essentially passes a law completely banning all Japanese immigration to the United States.
Just a blanket ban.
Yeah, lumping them in with other Asian nations that were already excluded under earlier racist legislation.
The reaction in Tokyo cannot be overstated. It was visceral outrage.
I can imagine.
You have to remember, Japan had spent the last 50 years desperately modernizing, industrializing, and successfully fighting wars against China and Russia, specifically to prove to the West that they were an equal, civilized power.
They played by all the imperial rules.
Exactly. And the 1924 Immigration Act was the U.S. Congress essentially slamming the door in their face and saying, no matter what you do, we will never see you as equals.
That hurts. I mean, I read quotes from Japanese commentators at the time who were literally calling it the opening guns of a race war.
It felt like a declaration of hostility.
There were massive public rallies. Some citizens even committed ritual suicide in protest outside the American embassy.
It was a deep, deep psychological wound for the nation.
And how did the military factions use that?
It completely discredited the pro-Western liberal politicians in Tokyo who had been arguing for diplomacy and cooperation.
Right, because the diplomats looked like fools.
Exactly. The ultranationalists could now turn to the public and say, look, the West hates us. Diplomacy is a trap. The only language they respect is force.
And right as this psychological wound is festering, the bottom falls out of the economy.
The timing couldn't be worse.
In 1927, you have the Shōwa financial panic. Let's unpack this a bit, because this panic accelerates a major structural problem in Japan. The dominance of the zaibatsu.
The zaibatsu, yes.
What were they exactly?
They were these massive, family-controlled corporate monopolies. Think of them like mega conglomerate companies you still hear about today, like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo.
Okay, I know those names.
Right. They didn't just make one thing. They controlled the banks, the shipping lines, the heavy industry, the mining.
They owned everything.
Pretty much. During the 1927 banking crisis, dozens of smaller regional banks collapsed. The zaibatsu swooped in, absorbed the remaining capital, and effectively monopolized the entire Japanese economy.
So you have a situation where a handful of ultra-wealthy families control the lifeblood of the nation.
While everyone else suffers.
Right, and the civilian government, led by Prime Minister Wakatsuki Rajiru at the time, looks weak and beholden to these corporate interests.
They looked completely bought and paid for.
And then the Great Depression hits.
Just a cascading failure.
From 1928 to 1932, it is just economic carnage. The price of silk, which was a massive export to the U.S., plummets.
The U.S. stopped buying luxury goods.
Exactly. The price of rice collapses. Exports drop by half.
And this is where the macroeconomic data turns into a violently personal grievance.
How so?
Because the people suffering the most weren't the elites in Tokyo, it was the rural farmers. They were losing their land, they were starving, and in some desperate cases, families were selling their daughters into prostitution just to survive.
That is heartbreaking.
It's grim.
And here's the connective tissue to the military crisis. Where did the Japanese Imperial Army get most of its recruits?
The countryside.
Ugh.
The army was predominantly made up of young men from these exact rural farming communities.
Oh, wow.
So you have these young soldiers and junior officers sitting in their barracks, receiving letters from home about their families starving, and then they look at Tokyo.
And what do they see?
They see the politicians squabbling, they see the zaibatsu getting obscenely rich, and they see diplomats signing treaties that humiliate Japan internationally.
That is a terrifyingly combustible mix.
It's a powder keg.
You have an army composed of angry, armed, radicalized men who feel the civilian government is utterly corrupt and betraying the nation.
Exactly. And the civilian government just keeps pouring gasoline on the fire.
What do they do next?
Well, in 1930, the London Naval Treaty is ratified. Japan had tried to negotiate a slightly better ratio for heavy cruisers, aiming for a 10.0.7 ratio with the U.S. and U.K.
Okay, slightly better than 5.5.3.
Right. The negotiations were intense, and Japan ended up with a complex compromise that gave them a slight advantage in some categories,
Yeah.
but still locked them into subordinate limits overall.
I'm guessing that didn't go over well.
The public, egged on by the military, went ballistic. They viewed it as yet another surrender to the West.
More humiliation.
Yes. The vitriol against the government was so extreme that in November of 1930, the Prime Minister, Hamaguchi Osachi, was shot at Tokyo Station by a member of an ultra-nationalist secret society.
Right in the train station.
Yep. He eventually died from his wounds the following year.
Which ushers in a really dark period where the phrase government by assassination becomes horrifyingly accurate.
It's a chilling phrase, but it's true.
Over the next few years, prime ministers, generals, and prominent businessmen are routinely murdered by rogue factions of young, radicalized military officers.
They believed they were violently cleansing the nation of corruption to restore power directly to the emperor.
I really need to stop you here and ask a fundamental question.
Sure.
Because when you say government by assassination, it implies total anarchy.
It does.
Was the civilian government secretly complicit in this? Like, were they turning a blind eye to these military factions because they secretly wanted an empire, or were they literally just held hostage by their own army?
It's a crucial distinction. By the early 1930s, the civilian government wasn't secretly pulling the strings. They were fundamentally powerless to stop it.
Completely powerless.
Yes. And this wasn't an accident. It was a structural flaw built into the modern Japanese state decades earlier during the Meiji era.
Wait, how so? How is it structural?
When Japan modernized in the late 19th century, they had to break the power of the old samurai class and the regional feudal lords, the daimis.
Right, unify the country.
To do that, the architects of the Meiji state instituted mass education and a national conscription army. But they needed a unifying force for that army.
The emperor.
Exactly. So they legally and spiritually tethered the military directly to the emperor, explicitly bypassing the civilian parliament.
Oh, wow.
The military commanders had the right of direct access to the throne.
So structurally, the military doesn't answer to the prime minister at all. They answer only to God, essentially.
Precisely. They believed they were the true voice of the emperor's will. So when civilian politicians tried to cut military budgets or sign peace treaties, the military could simply say, "You are interfering with the supreme command. You don't have the authority to tell us what to do."
That is insane. And that structural flaw results in one of the most brazen acts of insubordination in modern history.
The Mukden incident.
Let's talk about the summer of 1931. The civilian government is locked in the trunk, and the military is driving the car straight off a cliff.
It's the true point of no return.
Set the scene for us.
Japan had a garrison army stationed in Manchuria in northern China known as the Kwantung Army. They were there originally to protect Japanese railway and economic interests.
Just a guard force, basically.
Right. But the officers of the Kwantung Army, acting entirely on their own, decided that Japan needed the vast resources of Manchuria to survive the global depression and prepare for a future total war.
They just decided this on their own.
Completely independently.
So, on the night of September 18th, 1931, these rogue officers plant a small amount of dynamite next to the tracks of the Japanese-owned South Manchuria Railway near the city of Mukden.
And it's a terrible bombing job, by the way?
Yeah. The explosion is so weak it barely damages the tracks. A train literally passes over it minutes later.
But it doesn't matter.
It doesn't. They blame the explosion on Chinese dissidents, use it as a pretext, and immediately launch a full-scale invasion of Manchuria.
And back in Tokyo, the civilian government is panicking. They send explicit orders to the Kwantung Army to stop the advance and contain the incident.
And the Kwantung Army just ignores them.
Completely ignores them.
Yeah.
They essentially said, "We are acting in the interest of the emperor," and they kept marching.
Unbelievable.
Within 6 months, they conquered an area larger than France and Germany combined.
Just rogue generals taking over a continent.
Yes. They established a puppet state called Manchukuo and even installed Puyi, the last emperor of China, as a figurehead ruler to make it look legitimate.
And because the Japanese public, hungry for good news and economic relief, absolutely cheered this conquest, the civilian government had to retroactively approve it.
They had no choice if they wanted to survive politically.
They were totally sidelined. When the League of Nations condemned the invasion, the Japanese delegation just stood up and walked out of the hall in Geneva.
A dramatic exit.
Japan was officially isolated, militarized, and aggressively expanding.
And here is where the narrative shifts.
Oh, so.
Because you cannot mobilize millions of citizens for a grueling continent-wide war of conquest by just telling them you want more coal and iron.
Right. People don't die for coal.
Exactly. You need a grand ideological narrative. You need a moral justification.
You can't just conquer half of Asia without a story to tell yourself.
No.
And the story they engineered was incredibly sophisticated and dangerously appealing. It was built around the concept of the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere.
The philosophical root of this was a phrase called hakuichu.
What does that mean?
It translates to uniting the 8 corners of the world under one roof, meaning, of course, under the benevolent rule of the Japanese emperor.
The propaganda pitch to the rest of Asia was fascinating because it weaponized very real historical grievances.
It absolutely did.
The Japanese propagandists would point to the ABCD powers, the Americans, British, Chinese, and Dutch, and say, look at what Western imperialism has done to Asia.
They have carved up our lands, stolen our resources, and treated us as racially inferior.
Right.
Which historically wasn't entirely wrong.
Right. Japan, the pitch went, is the only Asian nation that has successfully mastered Western industrialization and military tactics. Therefore, it is our destiny and our duty to lead a pan-Asian coalition.
We must unite under Japanese leadership to expel the Western colonialists and protect the spiritual, harmonious values of the East against the crass, individualistic materialism of the West.
Asia for the Asiatics. It sounds like a liberation movement on paper.
It does.
But the reality of what happened when the Imperial Army actually arrived in these territories was unimaginably horrific. It wasn't a coalition of equals.
Not even close.
It was a brutal, extractive, techno-fascist empire.
The management of these occupied zones was highly methodical. The military brought in organizationally minded bureaucrats and engineers from Tokyo.
They were running it like a giant factory.
Exactly. Their only mandate was to maximize resource extraction for the war machine. They prized industrial efficiency above human life, implementing forced labor on a massive, massive scale.
And the atrocities committed under this regime are some of the darkest chapters in human history.
Truly.
The historical records detail acts that honestly defy comprehension, many of which were tolerated or actively encouraged by the Imperial General Headquarters.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge the staggering scale of the violence.
It is essential to confront it if you want to understand the era.
What are some of the key events the sources highlight?
Well, you have Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit based in Pingfeng.
And what were they doing?
They conducted lethal human experimentation vivisections without anesthesia, testing biological weapons on thousands of Chinese and Allied prisoners of war.
Just horrific.
Then you have the Senkosakusen, which is often translated as the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all.
Kill all, burn all, loot all.
Yes. This was a scorched earth strategy implemented in northern China to deprive communist guerrillas of any civilian support.
How many people died from that?
It resulted in the deaths of over 2 million Chinese civilians.
2 million.
And of course, the Nanjing Massacre in 1937, where over the course of just 6 weeks, the Imperial Japanese Army murdered hundreds of thousands of disarmed combatants and civilians and perpetrated widespread systemic rape.
To understand how ordinary men could commit these acts on such a massive scale, you have to look at the domestic conditioning, right?
Yes, it didn't happen in a vacuum.
The Shōwa regime had cultivated a deeply ingrained doctrine of racial superiority. They preached the sacred nature of the Yamato Damashi, the unique divine Japanese spirit.
So they were essentially combining the idea of gukutai, the sacred state we talked about earlier, with an ethno-nationalist supremacy.
Like a lethal combination of church, state, and race.
Exactly. From a very young age, citizens and soldiers were explicitly taught that they were a spiritually superior race.
How did they view the people they were conquering?
Captured Chinese soldiers and civilians were systematically dehumanized in the propaganda. The ideology convinced the Japanese soldiers that the people they were supposedly liberating were actually subhuman, unworthy of mercy, and existing solely to serve the needs of the Japanese Empire.
But this is where the source material we are reviewing throws a massive, complex curveball that honestly takes a moment to process.
That's a bizarre contradiction.
Because Japan is building this racially motivated, ultranationalist empire. And in 1940, to counter the Western powers, they signed the Tripartite Pact, officially forging the Axis alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy.
A military alliance of fascist states,
Right. So you would naturally expect Japan to adopt all of their allies' policies.
including the racial ones.
But the historical records highlight a deeply complex contradiction regarding the treatment of Jewish refugees.
It is a critical nuance that really challenges our assumptions about how the Axis alliance functioned behind the scenes.
Tell us about it.
Well, prior to the Tripartite Pact, Japan had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany, and they certainly imported various aspects of Nazi ideology. But the Japanese government explicitly and officially refused to implement Nazi-style anti-Semitic policies in their territories.
And this wasn't just some quiet internal memo passed around the cabinet.
No, it was very public.
The foreign minister, Yusuke Matsuka, who was a fiercely nationalist figure, point-blank stated, "Nowhere have I promised that we would carry out his anti-Semitic policies in Japan. This is not simply my personal opinion, it is the opinion of Japan, and I have no compunction about announcing it to the world."
That is a direct rebuke to Hitler.
It is, and it translated into tangible action on the ground. The records highlight several astonishing instances.
Yeah, 1938, you have Imperial Japanese Army General Kiichiro Higuchi and Colonel Norihiro Yasui, who actually facilitated the entry of roughly 20,000 Jewish refugees into Manchukuo, the puppet state of Manchuria, allowing them to escape Nazi persecution.
20,000 refugees.
Right.
And then there is the incredible story of Chune Sugihara.
A fascinating guy.
He was a Japanese diplomat serving in Lithuania in 1940. Defying direct orders from Tokyo to stop, he spent weeks frantically handwriting transit visas, allowing over 6,000 Lithuanian and Polish Jews to flee the impending Holocaust by traveling through Soviet territory to Japan.
He saved thousands of lives and was later recognized by Israel as righteous among the nations.
It is a remarkable story of individual moral courage.
It really is.
It is, but I have to ask you to help me make sense of the macro-level state policy here.
Okay.
How could a military empire justify defying its own Nazi allies to save Jewish refugees while simultaneously committing unspeakable, racially motivated atrocities against their Chinese neighbors right across the border? It's a mind-boggling contradiction.
It absolutely is. And to understand it, we have to look past the idea of pure humanitarianism.
Okay.
We have to view it through the incredibly cold, calculating lens of imperial statecraft.
What do you mean?
The Japanese High Command's refusal to persecute Jews wasn't primarily born out of deep moral empathy. It was a mechanism of projecting power.
Projecting power? How?
By explicitly refusing Hitler's demands on the Jewish question, Japan was projecting an image of total independent sovereignty. They were signaling to Berlin, "We are an empire. We are your equals, not your subordinates. We will dictate the racial and political policies within our own sphere of influence, and we will not be ordered around by a European power."
So it was a massive geopolitical flex.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Furthermore, some Japanese policymakers actually held bizarre anti-Semitic beliefs that Jewish people controlled global finance beliefs, ironically imported from European texts. But instead of concluding that Jews should be exterminated, their pragmatic, bureaucratic mindset concluded, if they control global finance, we should offer them safe haven and utilize their capital and expertise to help build our empire in Manchuria.
That is a chilling level of pragmatism.
Extremely chilling.
We will protect you, but only because we think we can use you.
Exactly. It was a uniquely Japanese brand of techno-fascism, and this relentless pragmatism, which bordered on fatalism, is exactly what brings us to the precipice of the Pacific War.
Right, because the war in China, which had escalated into a full-scale invasion after another staged incident at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937, had bogged down into a massive, bleeding stalemate.
They were stuck.
Japan is pouring men and machines into the vastness of China, and they're burning through natural resources at an unsustainable rate. Specifically, oil.
Oil was the Achilles heel. Japan is an island nation with very few natural resources. They were heavily dependent on imports to keep their war machine running.
Where did they get their oil?
Mostly the U.S. But as the atrocities in China became public, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, who control the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, started threatening to cut off those vital materials.
And when Japan refused to pull its troops out of China and instead moved to occupy French Indochina, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt finally dropped the hammer.
He did.
In July 1941, he froze Japanese assets and implemented a total oil embargo.
For the Japanese military, this was a death sentence.
How long did they have?
The Navy calculated they had perhaps 18 to 24 months of oil reserves left. After that, the ships couldn't sail, the planes couldn't fly, they were on a ticking clock.
And the way the sources describe the decision-making process in Tokyo during the fall of 1941 is just terrifying.
It's not what you'd expect.
No. Because you'd assume an empire launching a war against the industrial might of the United States would be filled with confident bravado.
Right, cheering and boasting.
But it wasn't. It was pure fatalism.
They knew they couldn't win a protracted war of attrition against the United States.
They already knew.
Yeah. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, famously warned that he could run wild for 6 months to a year. But after that, he had absolutely no confidence in ultimate victory.
There is this quote from a key civilian official advising the emperor in November 1941 that perfectly captures this bleak mindset.
What did he say?
He essentially says, if we miss the present opportunity to go to war, we will have to submit to American dictation. He calls the war inevitable, hoping that things will go well early on, but openly admitting there will be increasing difficulties over time.
They looked at the geopolitical chessboard and made a terrifying calculation.
What was the math?
They chose a high-risk war with an incredibly low probability of long-term success over what they perceived as a guaranteed descent into third-class status and the slow strangulation of their empire.
So, with the emperor's final silent approval at the Imperial Conference, they pull the trigger.
Yes.
On December 7, 1941, they launched the surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, while simultaneously striking British and Dutch strongpoints all across Southeast Asia.
And for about 6 months, Yamamoto's prediction holds exactly true.
They ran wild.
The Empire of Japan expands at a blistering pace, creating one of the largest maritime empires in human history.
But then comes June 1942.
The turning point.
The Battle of Midway. The U.S. Navy intercepts the Japanese fleet, sinks 4 of their frontline aircraft carriers, and the momentum completely irrevocably shifts.
It's all downhill from there for the Japanese military.
The U.S. begins its island-hopping campaign, pushing the Japanese military back across the Pacific, and the devastation that follows as the war reaches the Japanese home islands is apocalyptic.
It's the systematic destruction of a nation.
We are talking about U.S. bombers under General Curtis LeMay initiating a campaign of firebombing.
Using incendiary weapons on wooden cities.
The March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo alone kills over 100,000 civilians in a single night, turning the entire city into an inferno.
Unimaginable horror.
And then, in August 1945, the final blows. The atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing a new terror upon the world.
Simultaneously, the Soviet Union declares war and invades Manchuria, absolutely crushing the Kwantung Army in a matter of days.
The human toll is staggering. By the end, 2.1 million Japanese military personnel are dead.
2.1 million.
And the specific detail from the historical data is just harrowing. Roughly 80% of the military deaths in the Philippines and 50% of the deaths in China weren't from combat.
What were they from?
They were from starvation and malnutrition.
Oh, wow.
The logistical supply lines of the empire had completely collapsed. Add to that the hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths from the bombings.
It is total systemic collapse of the nation.
Right.
On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito takes to the radio, which, by the way, was the first time the Japanese public had ever heard his voice.
Right. He was treated like a god. Nobody ever heard him speak.
Exactly. He announces the surrender, famously stating that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage.
The understatement of the century.
Quite literally.
By the time the surrender documents are signed in September, there is nothing left. The cities are ash. The economy is obliterated. The leadership is utterly discredited.
And for the first and only time in its entire recorded history, Japan is occupied by a foreign power.
And if you are a Japanese citizen standing in the rubble in 1945, you would reasonably assume that the goal of the occupying forces led by the Americans and General Douglas MacArthur would be pure, unadulterated subjugation.
Right. They had just fought a brutal, racially charged total war. Why wouldn't it be?
But what actually happens during the occupation is one of the most fascinating geopolitical pivots in history.
MacArthur arrives as the supreme commander for the Allied powers. And initially, the goal is demilitarization and democratization.
They want to tear out the roots of Japanese militarism so it can never grow back.
They immediately dismantle the imperial military apparatus. They set up the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo War Crimes Trials.
Right, their version of Nuremberg.
Exactly. They prosecute and execute major wartime leaders, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo.
But MacArthur makes a massive, highly calculated, and honestly highly controversial decision regarding Emperor Hirohito.
This is where history pivots.
Many of the Allied nations wanted Hirohito tried as a war criminal and hanged.
The Soviets and the British certainly did.
But MacArthur spares him.
MacArthur realized that completely dismantling the imperial institution, which had been the spiritual center of the nation for decades, might lead to absolute chaos.
Like Civil War level chaos.
Mass starvation, complete societal breakdown, and possibly a communist uprising, making the occupation totally unmanageable.
So instead of a trial under the new 1947 Constitution drafted by the Americans, Hirohito is forced to renounce his divine status.
He has to go on the radio again and say he's not a god.
Right. He is stripped of all political and military power, reduced to a mere symbol of the state. He goes from being a living god to a constitutional figurehead.
And the democratic reforms pushed through during this early phase are sweeping. It's democratization on hyperdrive.
Give us some examples.
The massive zaibatsu monopolies we talked about earlier, they are officially broken up to decentralize economic power. Labor unions are legalized.
A total 180 from the Peace Preservation Law.
Right. Women are granted the right to vote in 1946, fundamentally altering the political landscape.
And most famously, they draft Article 9 of the new Constitution.
The Pacifist Clause.
This clause literally outlaws war as a means to settle international disputes and forbids Japan from maintaining an army, navy, or air force. Japan officially becomes a pacifist state.
The United States wanted to ensure that Japan could never, ever threaten the world again.
But geopolitics rarely sits still, does it?
No, it never does. Almost as soon as the ink is dry on this pacifist constitution, the global map shifts dramatically.
The Cold War.
The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union begins to escalate. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces win the Chinese Civil War. In 1950, the Korean War breaks out.
And suddenly, the calculus in Washington changes entirely.
Overnight.
They look at a weak, demilitarized, pacifist Japan, and they no longer see a peaceful triumph.
No, they see a massive, vulnerable vacuum right on the doorstep of communist China and the Soviet Union.
And this panic leads to a dramatic policy shift that historians call the reverse course.
The reverse course.
The U.S. essentially realizes they don't want a weak pacifist dependent. They want a strong, heavily armed anti-communist bulwark in the Pacific.
It is an incredible whiplash.
It's like an architect forces you to demolish this dangerous, aggressive fortress to build a peaceful, tranquil public park.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right, but then a few years later, that same architect starts to panic about the neighborhood, secretly hires the original warlords who ran the fortress, and tells them to start building defensive walls around the park.
That analogy captures the absurdity and the pragmatism of it perfectly.
Because to ensure anti-communist stability, the U.S. occupation forces champion clemency policies.
They do a total reversal on justice.
They halt the purges of wartime officials. They actually release surviving Class A, B, and C convicted war criminals from prison.
And these aren't just foot soldiers. These are the architects of the wartime empire.
Exactly. Men like Nobusuke Kishi, who was a top economic bureaucrat in Manchukuo and served in Tojo's wartime cabinet.
Right. He was locked up in Sugamo prison.
He is released from Sugamo prison, re-enters politics with American backing, and actually becomes the Prime Minister of Japan in 1957.
It blows my mind. The very men who waged war against the United States are now installed as the U.S.'s most vital Cold War allies.
And they don't just bring back the politicians, they bring back the military.
Oh, yeah. In 1947, heavily encouraged by the U.S., Japan establishes the National Police Reserve, which is essentially 75,000 men armed with light infantry weapons.
A military in all but name, entirely bypassing Article 9.
Precisely. And by 1954, as the Cold War deepens, this evolves into the Japan Self-Defense Forces.
The SD.
Yes. It becomes the de facto post-war army, navy, and air force, eventually growing into one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world, despite having a pacifist constitution.
The psychological whiplash for the Japanese populace here must have been intense.
I can't even imagine.
You are told to fight to the death against the Americans. Then you are told to embrace American pacifism. Then you are told to rearm to fight the communists.
It's dizzying.
But out of this chaos emerges a highly pragmatic survival strategy that defines the rest of the Shōwa era. It was championed by Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, and it became known as the Yoshida Doctrine.
A brilliant strategy, really.
Help us understand how this doctrine worked, because it is the launchpad for everything that comes next.
The Yoshida Doctrine was a stroke of geopolitical genius born out of pure necessity. The deal Yoshida struck with the U.S. was simple. Japan would completely outsource its national security to the United States.
Okay, so the U.S. handles the defense.
Right. The U.S. would maintain military bases across Japan, solidified by security treaties in 1951 and 1960, and provide a nuclear umbrella.
And what does Japan do in return?
In return, Japan would take the entirety of its national energy, capital, and focus and pour 100% of it into unrestrained economic growth.
It's like being allowed to live rent-free in a heavily guarded, incredibly secure gated community, which frees you up to take every single dollar of your paycheck and pour it into starting a tech business.
Exactly. You don't have to worry about the perimeter wall. You just focus on scaling your company.
And that focused energy sets the stage for one of the most astonishing economic recoveries in human history, the Japanese miracle.
By the 1950s, Japan is rebuilding itself at a speed that defies logic.
The cities rise from the ashes. And what's wild, according to the economic data we have, is that this wasn't achieved by relying massively on foreign capital or foreign ownership.
No, it was very domestic-driven.
A massive unintended catalyst was actually the Korean War in 1950?
Yes, the Korean War was an absolute economic lifeline for Japan.
How did that work?
The U.S. and UN forces needed a massive logistical staging ground close to the Korean peninsula. Japan was the perfect location.
Ah, so they were buying supplies locally.
Exactly. Orders for trucks, blankets, communications equipment, and raw materials just flooded into the Japanese economy. It was a massive injection of capital that kick-started their industrial engines.
But it wasn't just luck. It wasn't just being in the right place at the right time. The Japanese miracle was heavily orchestrated, wasn't it?
Very much so. The government established the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, famously known as MEIE, in the 1950s.
And the mechanics of how MIT operated are fascinating.
MIT was the brain of the economic miracle. They didn't operate a command economy like the Soviet Union, but they didn't leave things to the free market either.
It was a hybrid.
They used something called administrative guidance. MET bureaucrats would coordinate with corporate leaders, foster cooperative arrangements, protect domestic markets from foreign competition using strict tariffs, and aggressively channel capital into strategic, export-oriented industries.
Like which ones?
First steel and shipbuilding, then eventually automobiles and electronics.
And here is the detail from our sources that just stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
When you look at the people running MITI, the architects of this peacetime economic miracle, they were the exact same organizationally minded bureaucrats and engineers who previously managed the wartime techno-fascist empire in places like Manchuria.
It is a profound, almost unsettling observation on the nature of technocracy.
It really is. Paint a picture of this for us. You have a bureaucrat who, in 1941, was sitting in an office in Manchukuo, ruthlessly optimizing the extraction of coal and iron to feed the imperial war machine, completely ignoring democratic norms in the name of efficiency.
Right.
Then, jump forward to 1961, that exact same guy is sitting in an office in Tokyo wearing a suit, ruthlessly optimizing the export of consumer electronics and automobiles to the American market.
It's the same skill set. The ideals of efficiency, modernization, and top-down engineering solutions to complex societal problems didn't disappear when the empire fell.
The human capital remained.
The bureaucratic machinery simply changed its objective. They redirected that intense, almost militaristic focus from territorial conquest to corporate capitalism. And it worked to a degree no one thought possible.
The milestones of this era just start firing off like a machine gun. On the political front, you have stabilization with the 1955 system.
Right, the 1955 system.
Let's explain that briefly because it's key to the stability. It's technically a multi-party democracy, but the conservative Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, forms a massive coalition and essentially takes continuous dominant control of the government for decades.
It provided the political continuity that MIT and the corporations needed to plan long-term strategies.
Yeah.
They didn't have to worry about policy reversals every election cycle.
And with that stability, the infrastructure explodes. In 1964, Tokyo hosts the Summer Olympics.
A massive moment.
This is their grand re-entry onto the world stage, and the games are officially opened by Emperor Hirohito himself, which is just a wild full-circle moment.
To go from presiding over a devastated, defeated nation in 1945 to welcoming the world to a glittering, futuristic metropolis just 19 years later.
19 years. Also in 1964, just in time for the Olympics, they opened the Tokaido Shinkansen, the bullet train.
The famous bullet train.
It was the first high-speed rail system in the world, born from a speed record set by Japanese engineers in 1957. It connected Tokyo and Osaka, shrinking the country and symbolizing Japanese technological prowess.
The momentum was just unstoppable. By 1968, Japan had officially surpassed West Germany to become the second-largest economic power in the entire world, trailing only the United States.
They were an absolute economic titan, flooding global markets with high-quality, affordable goods.
But we have to acknowledge that this hypergrowth caused massive domestic and international friction. It wasn't a seamless, happy ride.
Definitely not. The intense corporate culture, the birth of the grueling salaryman lifestyle took a heavy toll on the populace.
A massive social toll.
And politically, there was a massive pushback against the Yoshida Doctrine's reliance on the U.S.
You had the Ampo protests in 1960.
What were those?
They were massive, nationwide demonstrations against the renewal of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Hundreds of thousands of citizens took to the streets, fearing that being tethered to the U.S. military would drag Japan into another war.
And then there's Okinawa.
Right. You had the Koza riot in Okinawa in 1970, where locals violently protested the continued, heavy-handed presence of the U.S. military administration on the island.
And internationally, the economic success bred deep resentment.
The U.S. was getting nervous.
Very. By 1980, Japan became the biggest motor vehicle producing country in the world, beating the United States at its own game. Japanese electronics were everywhere.
This sparked massive trade deficits for the U.S. and a wave of intense Japan bashing in the West. American politicians were literally smashing Japanese radios on the steps of the Capitol.
Wow. And that economic friction led to a pivotal moment in 1985, the Plaza Accord.
The Plaza Accord.
This is crucial because it sets up the end of the era. What exactly happened at the Plaza Accord?
The U.S., France, West Germany, and the U.K. essentially cornered Japan. They argued that the Japanese yen was artificially weak, which made Japanese exports incredibly cheap and American goods uncompetitive.
Okay.
So, at the Plaza Hotel in New York, they forced an agreement to intervene in the currency markets to drastically strengthen the yen against the U.S. dollar.
Which means Japanese exports suddenly become much more expensive for the rest of the world to buy.
Exactly. To counter this sudden loss of export competitiveness, the Bank of Japan drastically lowered interest rates to stimulate the domestic economy.
Cheap money.
Cheap money everywhere. This flood of cheap money ignited one of the most massive asset bubbles in history. Real estate and stock prices in Japan skyrocketed to absurd, unsustainable levels in the late 1980s.
But even as this financial bubble was inflating, the late Shōwa era became the launch pad for Japan's massive cultural export boom.
They weren't just exporting cars anymore.
They were exporting culture. In 1985, Nintendo releases the Nintendo Entertainment System in the U.S., single-handedly revitalizing a global home video game industry that had completely crashed.
It's also the era where Japanese anime and manga begin to permeate continental Europe and the United States.
Laying the groundwork for the massive soft power influence Japan wields today.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the end of the era, and this really fascinating legacy mentioned in the texts. Shōwa nostalgia.
Ah, yes.
Emperor Hirohito dies in early 1989. Shortly after his death, the massive economic bubble bursts, leading to the lost decades of economic stagnation that Japan is still grappling with today.
Because the end of the Shōwa era perfectly coincided with the peak of Japan's economic might, the era has taken on a mythical status in the modern Japanese consciousness.
There are TV programs dedicated to recreating the era, memorial parks designed to look like 1960s Tokyo, and I even saw a note that in 2020, marine biologists discovered a new genus of sea slug and named it Shōwa Jidaya just to honor the era.
That's amazing.
But stepping back, I want you to help me process the sheer strangeness of Shōwa nostalgia.
It is strange.
How can a modern society feel a deep, comforting nostalgia for a 63-year block of time that contains both the golden age of video games and the bullet train, and the most traumatic, devastating, brutally violent war in the country's entire history?
It is a profound paradox. But it makes sense when you consider what Japan became in the decades following the Shōwa era. What political scientists call an abnormal great power.
An abnormal great power.
They became an economic behemoth, but remained militarily restricted and heavily reliant on the U.S.
So the nostalgia isn't for the militarism or the war itself.
Exactly. The nostalgia is likely tied to the sheer, undeniable velocity of progress.
The momentum.
Yes. It is a longing for a time when the nation felt a singular, unified sense of purpose. Whether it was the dark purpose of building an empire or the bright purpose of rebuilding from the ashes to conquer the global economy, the Shōwa era was defined by momentum.
That makes total sense.
When you compare that incredible, relentless momentum to the economic stagnation, the aging population, and the political drift that has persisted since the 1990s, it's easy to see why people look back at that specific window of time and feel a yearning for that lost national energy.
We have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today.
We really have.
We have traced the arc of a nation from the fragile, contradictory Taishu democracy of the 1920s down into the dark, brutal valley of militarism and the Pacific War, through the radioactive ashes of a foreign occupation, and finally up to the absolute peak of a miraculous economic recovery.
And all of it, every single bit, unfolded under the reign of one man, Emperor Shōwa.
It is a stark reminder of how quickly the tides of history can turn, and how incredibly adaptable human societies can be under extreme existential pressure.
It really is.
And it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought, something that wasn't explicitly answered in the texts, but something that the mechanics of this history absolutely demand we think about.
That's that.
The sources reveal that the Japanese miracle, this unparalleled life-saving economic recovery, was heavily orchestrated by the exact same organizationally minded bureaucrats and engineers who had previously managed a wartime fascist empire.
The MIT guys.
Yeah. So here's a question for you to ponder long after we sign off today. Does true miraculous economic efficiency sometimes require the sacrifice of messy, grassroots democratic freedom? Can a society achieve an economic miracle of that scale without the lingering, unified focus of a top-down, almost authoritarian structure?
It is an uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
We want to believe that democracy and efficiency always go hand in hand. But looking at the cold, hard mechanics of the Shōwa era, it is a vitally important question to ask.
Thank you so much for joining us in this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives of history, keep looking for the mechanics beneath the surface, and we'll see you next time.